All right, so now before moving on to Rudolf Steiner's book, The Fifth Gospel, I want to study this book that he wrote in between the Gospel of John, which we have just finished covering. Those lectures were given in 1908, and the Fifth Gospel, those lectures were given in 1913. But going through this little book here, which I think is one of Steiner's best lecture cycles, The Principle of Spiritual Economy, which was given in 1909. So it's just about a year after his commentary on the John Gospel. But going through it will help prepare the way and make a little more comprehensible Steiner's ideas about Christ and the various subtle bodies that he has inherited from various individuals, such as Zarathustra and the Buddha and so forth. Steiner begins this with the first lecture, which is given in Heidelberg on January 21st, 1909, where he starts talking about initially what happens to the soul after death. And I'm actually going to read a couple of paragraphs here because I think it's very important. He says, when human beings pass through the portal of death, they first have certain experiences. Their first experience is the feeling that they are growing larger or that they are growing out of their skin. In other words, this is what such people describe who undergo hypnotic regression as leaving. They always say the same thing. They have this feeling of floating up out of their bodies. He says this has the effect of the human being attaining another perception of things than was the case earlier in physical life. Everything in the physical world has its definite place, either here or there, outside the observer, but that is not so in this new world. There it is as if the human being were inside the objects, extended with or within them, whereas earlier he or she was only a separate object in its own place. The second experience after death consists of a human being's attaining a memory tableau of the life just completed, so that all events in it recur in comprehensive memory. This process lasts a definite amount of time. For reasons that cannot be stated here today, the duration of this memory is shorter or longer depending on the individual. In general, the duration of this state can be determined from the length of time each human being was able to stay awake during the past life, continuously and without once succumbing to the forces of sleep. Supposing that the outer limit for a person staying awake continuously had been 48 hours, then the memory tableau after death will also be 48 hours. And thus, this stage is like an overview of the past life. And so what this is the life review. And Steiner was one of the first to say that what happens after death is a life review. A memory tableau, elsewhere he says, is spread out before you panoramically. And indeed, this is what the subjects in these hypnotic regression cases say, is that the first thing they do is they see their life spread out before them on what look like large movie screens, very large screens that surround them as they face their own council, what's called their own council of elders, who go over their life with them. Then the etheric body leaves the astral body, in which the ego is living. All three had been connected from the time they left the physical corpse, but now the etheric body separates itself from the other two and becomes an etheric corpse. However, today's human beings do not lose their etheric body completely, but take an extract or excerpt along with them for all times to follow. Let's see, let me skip a little bit, and then he says, there follows the condition of what is called kamaloka, the time of weaning the soul from the effects of physical sensuous existence, which lasts about a third of the time of a person's physical life. After the etheric body has been cast off, the astral body still contains all the passions, desires, and so on that it had at the end of life. They must be lost and purified, and that is kamaloka. That is absolutely correct. From what I've learned from these hypnotic regression cases, individuals cannot take within them into the larger realm, what he will call divashan here, hostility or earthly attachments or aggressions, anger or jealousy. All these earthly things have to be purged, and especially violent individuals, extremely violent individuals, have to undergo a process of purgation where their energy patterns have to be reconstructed, realigned, and so forth. And so it is a kind of purgatory that the individual has to go through. This also includes a what they describe as a bath of energy. A bath of this warm, pleasant energy floods through them, flushing out all the spiritual attachments, of physical, sensuous attachments to the earth. And so then he says, then the astral body is cast off, and here too the fruit, the astral essence, is taken along. But the rest, the astral corpse, dissolves into the astral world. The human being now enters Devachan, where he or she prepares in the spiritual world for a new life in the future. Here, human beings live with spiritual events and beings until they are again called into the physical world, be it because the karma of a person demands it, or because an individual is needed on the physical earth. So in just a few short paragraphs, he does describe a process that is completely veridical as far as I'm concerned, because I've cross-checked it with many, many cases of hypnotic regression, and also through talking with mediums as well. This is absolutely correct. So once he sets up this model and he says, okay, so this is the norm. For most people, this is what happens. Their etheric body disintegrates, their astral bodies disintegrate, and they're just left with their ego, which transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime. But he says there are special cases where, and this is the principle of spiritual economy, certain etheric bodies and certain astral bodies are too good to waste, that have been created by certain individuals that cannot just be dispensed with, but that can be inherited by subsequent individuals. So reincarnation, it turns out, for Steiner, is not just a simple process of the ego hopping from body to body, although that is the norm. So for his model, he continues by talking about Atlantis. And he's talking about Atlantis, how there were these oracles there at Atlantis, a sun oracle, a Mercury oracle, a Venus oracle, a Vulcan oracle, and so forth. There were like these little schools of initiation. And so there were individuals, a very powerful one named Manu, and this is, of course, the name of the flood survivor from Indian mythology, who selected 7 of the best of these initiates and took them with him into the east and migrated into the east. And these individuals inherited the etheric bodies of 7 of the previous greatest initiates on Atlantis. Their etheric bodies. Otherwise, he says they were perfectly normal. Now, the etheric body contains, so to quickly recap, we have a physical body in common with the mineral world, and we have an etheric body in common with the world of plants. That's what enables anything to live, has an etheric body. And we have an astral body, which gives us waking consciousness, which is the seat of animalistic passions and desires, territoriality, sexuality, so forth. And then the human ego, which is the monad, let's say, that transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime. So, but now, with Steiner, it's always more complex than that. The etheric body contains the principle of memory, the Sheldrakean morphogenetic field, and it also contains an individual's memories, talents, skills, and accomplishments that individual imprinted into that etheric body through a productive and fruitful lifetime. The astral body contains the passions and desires, but it also, too, has spiritual aspects to it. So he says here that, so these 7 initiates inherit the etheric bodies of these other initiates, and with Manu, they set up the early version of Indian civilization, which still is yearning dreamily for the spiritual world. The physical plane is not so real to them, and they really would rather not be here, so it becomes Maya for them, the realm of illusion. So this would be India. 7227 BC is the date that he gives it, which is the date for the setting up of sites like Mehrgarh. So India's Neolithic begins at about this time, but not its sophisticated high cultural realm. And then he says so that in Persia, meanwhile, at about 6400 BC, there lived this individual called Zarathustra. And Zarathustra traditionally is ascribed to 3 different dates. Scholars debate whether he lived about the time of Darius, 500 BC, which most of them favor, but I think it's wrong. The better date is 1200 BC because the Gathas that were written around that time, the language of the Gathas is too similar to the language of the Rig Veda for those cultures to have been separate for very long. So 1200 to 1500, somewhere in there, is a much better date for the life of Zarathustra. But then we have this legendary date that's transmitted by certain Christian authors and also by Plutarch of 6400 BC. And it is the date that is accepted by Mary Sedagast, who wrote 2 beautiful books, Plato Prehistorian, and she's a kind of a Steinerian as well, where she transforms the flood of Atlantis to the ending of the last ice age and the melting of the glaciers, which I think is very possibly correct. And then she accepts Steiner's date for Zarathustra at 6400 BC because there is a major difference that suddenly takes place with the agricultural villages and economies and so forth. What happens is that you've gotten agriculture and village existence up and running since 12,000 BC. And it has a couple of phases, the pre-pottery Neolithic A, the pre-pottery Neolithic B. But right about the time that Steiner says the original Zarathustra lived, there was a change. Suddenly, all kinds of new agricultural tools come into being. And agriculture itself becomes more of a duty, more of something that is the duty of the individual to perform. The ancestor cults are slowly fading out. They let go of them, which had skull worship along with it. They let all of that go, pretty much for the most part in these villages, and they create separate cemeteries in which they bury their dead. So the cemeteries are moved out. There is a whole transformation here that could be personified by one individual, let's say, and we'll call him Zarathustra. So we might grant Steiner and Mary Steadgast that much. There is a change. So he says then that, so with respect to Zarathustra comes along on the stage, and the early Persian world has a much more concrete relationship to the physical world than did the Indian civilization, which is concurrent with it, even though it got up and running several centuries before, and almost 1,000 years before. But the emphasis is now on doing work on the physical world. It isn't just illusion anymore. It's not just Maya. It's a real thing that conceals a spiritual world. But it's a world that requires physical work and duty and labor. And indeed that is true of Zoroastrianism. So then now, with respect to Zarathustra, his etheric body and his astral body. The etheric body... Let's start with the astral body. So Zarathustra's astral body is inherited by Hermes Trismegistus, the individual who founds the Egyptian mysteries, which may be a mythical person or maybe it was a real person. But he inherits Zarathustra's astral body, whereas Zarathustra's etheric body is inherited by Moses. And because the etheric body has very much to do with memory, it gave Moses the ability to read the Akashic record and to write the books that are associated with Genesis, the first 5 books of the Bible, but scholars are pretty certain that Moses didn't write any of that. But nonetheless, once again, we can personify it as though it were a single individual and call him Moses. So we have Moses inheriting the etheric body of Zarathustra. Hermes inherits the astral body. And then now Zarathustra's ego then is later inherited by, so in the 5th gospel, Steiner has this idea that there were these 2 Jesus children because Luke gives a different genealogy tracing the descent through Nathan, whereas Matthew gives a genealogy that traces the descent through Solomon. So we have a Solomonic Jesus boy who is living somewhere nearby, not that far away from a Nathan Jesus boy, and the Nathan Jesus boy would have been someone that we would regard as simple-minded, maybe a little bit backward, slow, but a very warm, loving individual. And in that respect, he has inherited the Buddha's astral body. But then the Solomon Jesus has the ego of Zarathustra. He's inherited Zarathustra's ego, but then he dies at around the age of 12, and Zarathustra's ego transmigrates somehow, he doesn't say how, to the Nathan Jesus, which is why at 12 years old they find him teaching in the temple. All of a sudden he has all this spiritual knowledge and wisdom. How is this possible? So that's sort of his genealogy for the 3 subtle bodies of Zarathustra. They're inherited by these founders of great mysteries. Moses founding the Old Testament world, Hermes the Egyptian world, and then and that would actually be, Hermes would actually be Tot, the god Tot, who is associated with writing, and then the Christian world coming into being. So he gives a couple of other more recent examples that I think are interesting. He says that Nicholas of Cusa, who lived in the 15th century, his astral body was inherited by Copernicus, who lived like a century later, which is one of the reasons why Scholars say that a lot of Copernicus's ideas are already prefigured in the works of Nicholas of Cusa, and scholars scratch their heads over this and can't figure out why there are so many similarities. Now, I haven't read Nicholas of Cusa, so I can't say what those are, but I have studied Arthur Kessler's wonderful biography of Copernicus. So another example is of Galileo. So Galileo gets everything up and running as far as the sciences go, pretty much sets it all up and gives it a huge impetus. So his etheric body, you can't just toss an etheric body that's full of knowledge of that many skills and ideas. You can't just toss that out. So it gets inherited by the individual named Mikhail Lomonosov in Russia, who in the middle of the 18th century becomes the greatest polymath and thinker in Russia. At that time, St. Petersburg is already up and running, and Lomonosov was a mathematician. He was interested in physics and chemistry, geology, the arts, history, and he laid the basic foundations for grammar and style that pretty much laid the foundations for the coming of Russian literature, which starts to kick in with Pushkin about a century later. So, and that is because, according to Steiner, Lomonosov has inherited Galileo's etheric body. What's interesting about that, if you think about Spengler's idea of this idea of a pseudomorphosis, which is a false formation, that one culture tries to express itself through the false forms of another culture because the influence of that culture lies so heavily over the land, and it's so much more sophisticated and further along in its development that the newborn culture has to express itself through these alien culture forms, as is the case with what he calls Magian civilization, Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization, which has to initially express itself through classical cultural forms. So he says the Pantheon, for instance, is the first mosque, and so forth. So he also says that Peter the Great then corresponds to Charlemagne. Charlemagne imports all of these Greco-Roman ideas, especially Roman ideas, lays the basis for the Holy Roman Empire, creates the school at Aachen, and so forth. So what happens then is that, or what I think is interesting in Spengler saying that Lomonosov, who is really the first great thinker in Russia, he founds Moscow State University in 1755. I mean, the guy was just a phenomenon. Is that he inherits specifically a European man's etheric body. It's almost as though, and then Steiner has not yet read The Land of the West because it's not published until 1918, but it's very interesting that he says it's specifically a European, even on the subtle plane, even on the astral plane, there's a pseudomorphic inheritance from Europe already at work in the Russian mind with Lomonosov. So I find that very, very fascinating. All right, so that's pretty much it for this chapter. So we'll leave it there for this opening lecture of Steiner's wonderful book here on spiritual economy.